and welcome to this episode of G220 Radio. My name is Mike, and I am alone. Once again, Ricky is not able to join us again for this week, and to try to keep some sort of promise that I have given, we're going to finish chapter 28 of Proverbs. So this episode is called Partiality is Not Good. And we'll be looking at the final 9 verses 20 through 28 of chapter 28. And that will leave us with 3 chapters remaining after tonight. And so we're almost there. Started this 5 years ago, something like that. It's been a long series. Hopefully it's been a blessing to you as we think about these things, as we just consider God's wisdom. We kind of always start shows this way, and I think it's a good reminder as we periodically go through this, is when we think about Proverbs and when we think about wisdom, Proverbs, especially chapters 10 to the end, have this very kind of hit you in the face kind of language, and it makes you think. And oftentimes we'll see, even in our verses today, it's oftentimes left open because it's a general term. It's a general saying. It's not going to be true 100% of the time, but in general, if you were to do these things, you will receive it. They're not promises. It's not like the gospel promise. If you repent and trust in the Lord, he'll save you. That's a promise. It's a gospel promise. Or the promise of, if you ask for wisdom, God will give it to you. That's a promise. These are sayings God has given to us that we can live in his world. They are built upon the laws of God, the 10 commandments, and it is then how we love one another and how we love God is often demonstrated in how obedient we are to the wisdom God has given to us here in Proverbs. And we'll even see a little bit here just in a few minutes with verse 20 that Proverbs expands out. It's not just Old Testament saints. This is God's word to us today and to live it. The applications are different than when Solomon first wrote them. How we think about them and how we maybe even understand them in light of further or more recent revelation, later revelation, but it's still wisdom. God is still helping us to know him and to live in his world. And I mean, just to think about that, how God just didn't give us these commandments: do this, don't do this, love the Lord your God, keep the Sabbath, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't covet. And those good, we need them. But he also has given us how do we enact the positive side of this law, the law that requires us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and to think more deeply then, because that's really what wisdom, if you see it, is. It's not necessarily just about how I act or who I am. It's really, we think about how do I interact with those whom God has created? How do I interact with the beast? How I treat them? How I treat fellow image bearers, fellow humans? And we think about this because God has kind of has told us to live a certain way, and then now he's given us Proverbs to show the different ways in which we can live out these commands. And most of what we'll see here in chapter 28 deal with money. Proverbs has dealt lots with money. We'll even go more into it. And to preface it, I think there's elements in which it may sound prosperity gospel-y. And I'm just going to talk about it and make notes. We shouldn't be afraid to say that God blesses us financially. Now, you're not going to hear sow your seed. You're not rich because you don't have faith. That's not how God works. We're going to try to understand it biblically, and what does that mean? But to also say that when we talk about financial, and I mean, even in the first verse, a lot of these verses the blessings aren't restricted to money and stuff. There is other things that are involved with it. I think with Proverbs, especially in light of what we see in the health and wealth gospel and name it and claim it and all of these different charismatic movements in this that really emphasize the physical, the here now, being rich, your best life now, is they miss that while these are blessings, not everyone experiences them. But oftentimes they're blessings that are connected to faithfulness towards God. And that's what we see right away here in verse 20. Verse 20, and we use the ESV here. At G220, it's the extra special version, has more anointing than any other version. And no, we like the ESV. I think it's a good translation. And so here it is in the ESV, Proverbs chapter 28, verse 20 says, "A faithful man will abound with blessings, but whoever hastens to the rich will not go unpunished." So when we get to this verse and we think about it, I want to to think about it is, what can we know here about, we're going to start with man. What does this verse tell us about men or man? And we see here that adjective, faithful. So the first part of this verse really gets into a certain type of man, a faithful man. John Gill in his commentary here talks about this kind of faithfulness is not just necessarily kind of geared with marriage in it, but is a moral sense. It's a guy or a woman whose yes is yes and their no's are no's. Whether they're in public or in private, they act with integrity. That's probably a word that we should associate here with faithful. This is a man who has integrity. He does what he's supposed to do. He honors contracts and agreements. He doesn't do things for his own sake. And so this type of man, a man who is faithful, a man who has integrity, we read here, will abound with blessings. Abound here is this kind of idea of being rich. We see it kind of in the verse that B about hasten to be rich. So here, to begin off, the faithful person, the faithful man, here gets a rich or a sense of many. You see this word oftentimes with like a mighty of works. This plenty, this lot, many. And so the blessed man has many, lots, abundance, overflowing, however you want to kind of describe it, of blessings. Again, well, what does it mean for blessing? Well, what are we talking about here? I think the vagueness allows us to see that this is all types of blessings. A man who has integrity and is upright, we see also as one who's being godly. So the source of these blessings are the blessings that come from the Lord for being obedient, doing what he calls us to do. And to note, like, we're not saying this faithful man is sinful or sinless. He's sinful. We're sinful. But it's the trajectory. It is most of the time he acts in this way. He is faithful. And in doing so, God has now blessed him. What are some ways that he could be blessed? He could be blessed financial. We see that there is obviously some sort of financial aspect because of verse 2 or the second part of the verse. But I think too, and Gil alludes to this, and I think it's helpful, is that the blessing is not just physically, not just stuff, but how he is received among others. See, if he's a faithful man and he acts in faithful, that means he's acting faithfully to those around him, those he interacts with. And if that's the case, if he is faithful, he's going to have blessings in which he is spoken well by others, by the people around him. He's not trying to clamor for the applause of the people around him. He's doing what God has called him, and to be faithful and to do the things that he is supposed to be doing. But an added benefit of doing what you're doing is, especially when you think of business or just seeing, a man and a wife and their marriage and how God blesses their marriage. We can think of these in different ways, but they're spoken well by others. And I mean, you see this in the list in 1 Timothy for elders in chapter 3. They're well spoken by outsiders. They're not ones who have done something that would cause a snare for those. They're not, elders are not in ways that have engaged in things that may have been sinful and tarnished the image of the church. And to think about it in that way, because in one sense, then if he's being well spoken of in the kind of the blessing of receiving this kind of applause of one sense of the people, is that the faithful one in the abundance of his blessing is blessing others with his wisdom. That's why he's being spoken well of. He's not in one sense hoarding the riches of his knowledge, but he is blessing others. So blessings he receives, he gives out, and in wisdom. And I think this is helpful maybe to think about the life of Jesus. And so we're going to look here in Luke 2. And in Luke 2, you have verses 40 and 52. And these are very much parallel verses. In verse 40, we have seen kind of the faithfulness of Mary and Joseph. They've done what they've needed to do to keep the commandments, to keep the Mosaic law, circumcise Jesus on the 8th day. And in verse 40, it says, "And the child grew up and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him." So we see this kind of favor or blessedness upon Jesus as a baby, as he's growing up, as he becomes strong. God is blessing him. Then you have this story of Jesus. We think around the age 12. The text does not tell us, or it does. He's 12 years old. And I should have studied this more. And he's in the temple. He is teaching the teachers. They marvel at his wisdom, but his parents have left to go back, and they've left him at the temple. We know the story. And that's where verse 52 comes in. Because you have in verse 50, and they didn't understand the saying. This is, sorry. In verse 45, we see, or 46, we see him 3 days later. He's in the temple, sitting with the teachers, listening and asking them questions. And they're all amazed of Jesus' understanding and his answers. His parents find him, and Jesus makes his comment about being in my Father's house, the temple. His family didn't understand the sayings that were spoken to him. He went with them to Nazareth and was submissive to them, and his mother treasured all of these things up in her heart. And then verse 52 says this, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So he's in the temple, he's answering with understanding, and we get this little glimpse that Jesus is finding favor or blessing with God and man. I think it's important that we see that it's both, that his wisdom, his understanding, his submissiveness to his parents, his faithfulness now has brought about this favor with God and man. And we know he doesn't keep favor with man throughout his entire ministry. They're going to crucify him. You don't crucify a man who is favored. He is blessed of God. He keeps that blessed. What we see here early, that the model in which Jesus is found to have favor with God and with man. And this verse mimics what we see actually in 1 Samuel. So this isn't, even for Jesus, this isn't original to him. Samuel is spoken of the same way. So in 1 Samuel chapter 2, we see Samuel, he's in the temple. His sons are Eli's son, the high priest, they're just being bad. And before we get to the story of the Lord rejecting Eli and his household, we get this small verse, verse 26. So 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 26. Now the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with man. We see here in Samuel's early life, working in the temple, a man who is faithful, and the Bible tells us that he has gained favor with the Lord and also with man. And we kind of see that played out. So I think we can consider that in our faithfulness, God blesses us richly, not with just favor with him, which we get whether man reciprocates that or not, but at times we'll receive favor with men. Again, that is being faithful with our lives. We are doing what God has called us to do. And then the second part of this verse, but whoever hastens to the rich will not go unpunished. Here, again, we have the faithful. So now we have this person who hastens to be rich. He wants to get rich quick. I think this may seem odd as a contrast to the faithful man. I think what is going on here, and a lot of the commentaries also kind of moved in this point, is that this hastenness to be quick, this quick rich person is doing so, but he's not faithful. He's not a man of integrity. He's a man who's trying to do whatever he can to get rich. And so he's doing these quick rich schemes where you may hurt others by scamming them in some sense or mistrusting them. I think of the show we did on MLMs about women be like going uh, private messaging other women is like, hey, you can be your own boss and you can make lots of money, and how that can be destructive. That women oftentimes like, are you trying just to treat me and sell me things? And we talked about that on our MLM show. I think those are the types of ideas. But we've already kind of looked at and thought about Proverbs 21:5. The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hastily comes up only to poverty. So the person who wants to get rich quick, they're scheming to be able to do it. They're hurting people along the way. It's a weird thing, but the Bible goes, will not go unpunished. Basically, they're going to be punished for their sins. If you try to use others to make a buck, you abuse others to make a buck, you're not enriching them, you're not blessing them, you're using them for your own end, you're going to be punished. And if it's illegal by the state laws, you may be punished in that way. Ultimately, you're going to be punished by God as you take advantage of others for your own gain. Walke, in his commentary, talks about this one. A faithful man will abound with blessings, but whoever hastens to be rich. Literally just, I copied and pasted the verse. We can see this this idea of richness leading to destruction in 1 Timothy. It's an often quoted verse, but we'll read both verses. So 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. And Paul writes to Timothy, and as it's being read out, Paul writes, to those who desire to be rich fall into temptation. So we see this desire to be rich, and they're going to fall in temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. When we desire to be rich, when we desire more, we covet what we don't have, and we go after it, we're going to fall into temptation. We're going to fall into snares and into many senseless and harmful desires so that we can make a buck. And then in verse 10, often misquoted, but what we read here is, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. There's this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. So this love of money drives these people, and it's so strong, they left the faith. They've gone away. We can think of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount about how you cannot love God and man. Either you're going to hate one or love the other. Here Paul tells us this desire will lead us into destruction, and that's in one part of the punishment. And so as Christians, we think about these verses, we should consider about how we are able to give blessings to those around us. Being faithful in what we do brings blessings to those around us as God gives us blessings, and we become more stable, whether it's financially, but just spiritually, about being ones who are level-headed. And it really challenges us, especially when we're constantly being bombarded by, if you do this, you can make passive income. And I don't do anything and I make $20,000 a month, and it's just around us. But this calls us to be people who trust doing hard work and blessing others, and not to be greedy and trying to find how we can make the most money quickest. I think this all really leads into, I mean, we still have quite a bit left, but this all leads us into, even when we think about these other verses coming up, and to consider what is going on, and to really dive into our hearts more. What does this desire for wealth, to be quick, what does it do? And in one way, it can have us show partiality. Verse 21 talks about, to show partiality is not good. For a piece of bread, a man will do wrong. Again, this idea we see here of trying to bribe someone, to show partiality to someone, and that for very, very little, a man will do something, a piece of bread, like a meal, essentially. A man will do what is wrong to make a quick buck. And so when we think about partiality, and even in our justice system, and when judges are not doing what they're supposed to, or when we see even our church, maybe some people are more favored than others, and they seem to be receiving I want to say it's not to show like a sinful desire, but just sometimes we pick people similar to us, and we maybe show more partiality to them than others, whatever that may be. And when we think about this, partiality is not something God does. God is not a respecter of persons. If you sin against God, you will receive the punishment due. We see that God does, that everyone is guilty for not worshiping God, because God's works are all around us. Everyone has the opportunity to sit and look and observe the world and worship God, and it is within their sinfulness that they don't. God doesn't show partiality to just certain people in America or certain people in Africa, and maybe he has this curse on all Africans, as some believe, with the curse from Noah, or Noah's son. And we can think about these, but God doesn't show partiality, or isn't a respecter of person. He saves both the rich and the poor, the ones who are in power and those who are not, slaves and slave owners in the past. God doesn't respect persons. But yet, when we engage in partiality, when we go through and try to advance ourselves by showing favor to some people, they kind of do it for cheap, for a quick buck. And they will do something that, when you think about, for a meal, they'll do something bad that will be punished more severely than what they received for it. So in our greed, when we show partiality, when we try to gain something by manipulating things, it just ruins it. Plus, the person that you've sinned against is now is not receiving blessings. You've hurt them. You haven't gotten to them. And if they would have done the same thing to you, you would have been upset. You can kind of see how the golden rule helps us and protects us with that. Verse 22, again, talking about greed, thinking about it, a stingy man hastens after wealth and does not know that poverty will come upon him. Again, the stingy man, I almost kind of think of like Scrooge McDuck. I mean, as much as I like DuckTales, Scrooge McDuck is not someone that we should be admiring. He's greedy. He hastens after wealth on these. You think about these trips. It makes a good cartoon, but it makes a terrible life. So the stingy man, what's interesting is the Hebrew doesn't, it's like stingy. We kind of have like a man that maybe is like really holds on to his money. I think there's an element of that, like hoarding it. But the text has it as someone with an evil eye. So they're kind of really looking. They're hoarding it. They're again greedy. They're going to do what they need to do to get it. The problem is that they're being short. Their memory or their actions are short term. As the verse or part B of the verse talks about, the stingy man does not know that poverty will come upon him. And to think about, well, how would poverty come up? If he's dealing wrongly, he might lose it all. If the state does its job and he's done something wrong, he should lose it. He will lose it. But I think also, and this comes more out of Ecclesiastes, is that he can gain all this wealth and he can keep all of this. But when he dies, he loses it all. And not only that, he has lost his soul and is now in hell. So being stingy and hastening after wealth is going to leave you poor, maybe not in this life, but in the life to come. And the money that you've gained in this life, well, it's going to go to someone else who didn't earn it, who didn't work for it, who didn't scheme in that way. And you lost it. Get it? So when we think about verse 22, it calls us not only to think about the short term, which maybe verse 20 and 21 had us consider, but the long-term view of this continued attitude towards wealth, this desire to make as much money as I can and to hoard it all and to keep it all and to put it in silos so deep that you can swim in the coins. When the person dies, all of that's gone. They can't take it with them. They're not going to be able to use it. And so as Christians, we need to understand not only the short-term benefits of being a faithful man and with what God has given to us and with the people around us, but then in our faithfulness now, we'll have blessing abundance, but we'll have ultimate abundance of blessings when we get to be with God in heaven as he pours out even more blessings and spiritual blessings upon us. I mean, even in Ephesians, that we're already being lavished with all spiritual blessings because of Christ. Verse 22 makes us now even consider even the longer term of what does that mean to be one desirous and how we don't keep our money here. Verse 23 seems to be maybe out of place a little bit, but I think one aspect of this, if we consider in the whole of like What are something that we can do as Christians? Verse 23 says, whoever rebukes a man will afterwards find more favor than he who flatters with his tongue. So you have a man who rebukes a person and find favor, which seems opposite. Like you would think, we think, and we've seen it, where if you rebuke someone, they turn against you. And they may try to hurt you or diminish your image, and you don't find favor, you don't find blessing there. But so you want to flatter this person, maybe that they will give you something. But I think we need to understand exactly what do we mean by rebuke. Some of the early Jewish writings gives this kind of idea of like this is kind of private, that it's maybe not afterwards, but kind of behind him and kind of this more private setting. So you see this person. And I think with greed, there's this kind of rebuke against the greed and what sins are coming out of or accompany the greed. So the person is rebuked for his sinful greed. Now, I think this can be applied to all sins, but I think in context, we're to consider this as this. You see this person who is sinful and greedy, and you rebuke him for it. And again, the rebuke is, I don't think, this kind of judgmental, you've done something wrong. It is a coming to him in love and showing his flaws in order that he may grow from them, that he can see them as they truly are, these sins, and then find forgiveness and change his ways by the power of God. So this isn't just this, I'm telling you you're wrong. It's this way to show them, like, you have done something wrong. You have sinned. And you should be putting off this sin and now putting on this new characteristic of being faithful, of not being stingy with your money, because you're not going to be able to keep it, and to do something with it in order that they may change and grow. Because what happens when you flatter the person with the tongue and kind of smooth talking is what the language gives, is that you inherently puff them up with an inaccurate view of themselves. You actually hurt them because you are in some ways deceiving them that they are better than what they are. And we see this. We hear this idea of like yes men. That's all they do is to do the bid of their master, in order that they may gain something, even if they know it's wrong, even if they don't agree with him. They do it in ways. And even in society, we kind of look down on those types of people. And to think about what that does then, about essentially encouraging these people to continue in their sin. So when the person rebukes them and is able to help them correct their way, they're going to find favor in the person who rebukes them because of the love that they showed. By saying, hey, you're going the wrong way. You should really consider that this isn't right, and you should go this way. Leave the path of sinfulness and move to the path of righteousness. And I think there is this element in which we have to understand that there is, in this switch, a conversion experience. That this is not something that someone does on their own power. They need the power of God. But I think that idea of the rebuke, that you're not living the way God has called you to live, and now here's the way you are to live the way God has called you to live, leads to this finding favor with that person. I mean, how much do we look fondly on those who brought us to Christ, who maybe even tried to tell us the gospel and we rejected them, only later to find favor because they were strong enough to tell us we need it. I think this is the idea verse 23 is getting at. Verse 24 kind of moves back now to possession as well. Verse 24 says, whoever robs his father and his mother and says, that's no transgression, is a companion to a man who destroys. So we see here this idea, this person, he who has taken from his father, from his mother. He has broken the 8th commandment in stealing, and also the 5th commandment and not honoring his mother and his father. But not only has he robbed his parents, he doesn't think he's done anything wrong. As if it's owed to him. As it's his for the taking. Gil kind of recognizes like this is really difficult, because if he's doing this to the people who love him the most, who want him to flourish, who are, and let's give them the benefit of doubt, they are trying to raise him up in the fear and admiration of the Lord. They are doing what Deuteronomy 6 tells them. When they rise up, when they lay down, they are talking about the works of God. They are learning about God. The mother and the father, they're not ones who are leading their children away. They're faithfully raising the children, and their child goes, "This is mine," and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. He's compared to one who destroys. I mean, just think about what just happened. And Gil notices if he's doing that to the ones who love him the most, he's going to do that to others. He's going to live this path of destructiveness. When studying this, I was reminded of Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. Here the Pharisees and scribes, they come to Jesus. He's in Jerusalem. And they accuse his disciples. The Pharisees and scribes say, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat." So the Pharisees had this tradition that before you eat, you are to ceremonially wash your hands so that they are clean. This isn't some sort of like being clean, like when I tell my kids to go wash their hands before they eat because their hands are gross and dirty and who knows what's on them, and that can be harmful for them or maybe catch them sick. This is not the type of washing the Pharisees are concerned with, or the scribes. The Pharisees and the scribes were concerned of this kind of purifying washing of hands that made one spiritually clean for the task. Now, the ceremony that they're talking about was to be done by the priest before a sacrifice, where they needed, in some sense, a spiritually cleaned hands in order to perform the sacrifice in a way that can be honored by God. So that's they're accusing. They're basically accusing the apostles for not honoring this kind of ceremonial cleansing before they eat. Jesus answered them, "And why do you break the commandments of God for the sake of your traditions? For God commands, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles his father or mother must surely die. But you say, if anyone tells his father or his mother, what you would have gained from me is given to God, he needs not to honor his father. For the sake of your traditions, you have made void the Word of God. I think verse 24 is another principle as kind of Jesus pulls some Old Testament texts out or texts from the Pentateuch, the Torah, and puts them together. We see that here in verse 25. Because the person the son who's supposed to give these things to his parents, say, no, I've given it to God instead, sometimes has robbed his parents. And because he's given it to God, he hasn't done anything wrong. And we see is that that's not right. We're to honor our mothers and our fathers. We're to help them to be, again, kind of the extension of chapter 20, that in receiving blessings from us and the blessings that we've gained from them, we give back those blessings. And the one who doesn't is like it's a companion to a man who destroys, who just seeks to tear down, to destroy relationships, burn bridges, as we may say. And that's not okay. Just for more wealth, more stuff. And yet, if my kids would do that to me, I would be upset. And rightly so. Again, the golden rule helps us into things about these furthers. But again, it's why is the children doing this? It's because they want to hoard up their money. Verse 25 again continues this idea of money and greed. It says a greedy man stirs up strife, but the one who trusts in the Lord will be enriched. So we're kind of working back through some of the stuff that we've already talked about. Here we see the actions of a greedy man. Earlier we saw a stingy man hastens, there's poverty. They're going to be punished going, but a greedy man in trying to gather his wealth stirs up strife. Because when we think about greed, what is greed? It's a coveting of things that are not theirs, these possessions, and then doing what you need to do to get what you want. And so a greedy man that stirs up strife is just showing his true colors, that he's going to use you, he's going to go against you. It may be a lawsuit here, a bad deal here, and he's going to go after people and create people that are just angry with him so that he can make more money. What we see in contrast, again, with the faithful man, the one who trusts in the Lord. So to be faithful, I'm going to connect that being faithful in verse 20 is one who trusts in the Lord. He will be enriched. He will be fattened like a calf. What do you think about that? I mean, I've sinfully fattened myself like a cat, but like a calf. But this idea here of being enriched, being grown, this kind of temporal and spiritual richness that the greedy man can't have. He can't do it. Because to be made rich is, again, I think, echoing that idea of being abounding in blessings, both temporal blessings and spiritual blessings. Being able to help, as we'll see here in a little bit, the needy, and yet still be able to live to help others. A greedy man doesn't care about helping others. The greedy man only cares about helping himself. But the Lord honors those who trust him, and he will grow them and enrich them, that they will be able to see kind of this, the blessings around them. Verse 26, again, seems to move away from this idea, but I think we can easily apply this text in how we've been talking about money and how greed stirs up strife, how those who try to get money quickly and without abandonment will receive punishments due. Verse 26 tells us, whoever trusts in his own mind is a fool, but he who walks in wisdom will be delivered. And so you have this idea of this man or this person, and they trust what comes to their mind. He's like, this is true, this is what I'm going to do, and no one's going to stop me. And he's a fool. When we listen to our own mind, when we disregard wisdom, when we listen to our, and in one sense, if we listen to our own heart, I think is another way to say this, the mind is an aspect of the heart, that whoever trusts in his mind, which is sinful, will do these things. They will naturally go after money and wealth and greed. I think there's this element of trusting that I know how to take care of myself. And this is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to hoard my money. I'm going to try to get rich any way possible. I'm going to do what I can, whatever I can, to do and finish that task. But the second part of this verse, he who walks in wisdom will be delivered, kind of gives this idea that wisdom is not in us. We naturally do not have wisdom. We need wisdom from outside of us. That we ourselves are not wise. Because if we in ourselves were wise, we could trust our mind. But as we saw, we can't. If we trust our minds, we're a fool. We hate God. We go after God. We act wrongly. We act sinfully. So wisdom has to come from outside of us. And as we've seen a lot in Proverbs, that oftentimes the wisdom that is outside of us is the wisdom of others who have received it from God through others. And even in that sense, that the wisdom we receive from God may not be directly from God. It can be through reading scripture and understanding and studying and applying into our lives. But wisdom also comes from others whom God has taught, maybe from others or from himself in the same way. But in either case, this wisdom comes from outside of us. It's not wisdom naturally to us. But when we even look at it, so we have this person, they're walking in wisdom. It's a pattern of life. It's like a path. They're walking in wisdom. And it says they will be delivered. They're going to be, so those who walk in wisdom, which, as we know from the beginning of Proverbs, is the fear of the Lord, will be delivered from this foolishness. Those who walk in wisdom are the ones who receive the blessing of the faithful man. Because to walk in wisdom is to be faithful. It is to do what is right. The one who walks in wisdom is the one who rebukes a man and finds favor. He doesn't steal from his parents, but honors them. And so to think about what it means to walk in wisdom is to walk in a way that honors God and shows our integrity. And again, it's this way of life. It's not just kind of one time thing, but this path in life that we travel. And in doing so, we'll be delivered from our sins because we trust in the Lord and are receive the spiritual blessings, knowing that in ourselves we're sinful. And so how does this play out when we think about wisdom, when we think about money and how to use money? Verse 27 moves us in that direction. Whoever gives to the poor will not want, but he who hides his eyes will get many a curse. I think there's an element when we think about giving to a poor, and I know this is a struggle for me at times, is knowing that not knowing whether a person that I'm trying to help is going to use, if I give them money, use it rightly for what they say they need it for. Now, oftentimes in past, we've done like bags of food. So if someone's saying they're hungry, we can give them something that is nutritious and helpful for them. Sometimes they turn them down and they just ask for money, and we're like, this is what we have, especially when we didn't have a lot of money to give out. But the idea here is looking outside of yourself. You're not hoarding these blessings of temporal money or stuff if you're buying it with money, but that you're looking around and you're seeing other image bearers and realizing that this money has come from God, and here are ways I can bless others. This is in some sense why we see offerings and why we are to give generously to the church. And we see in Paul, like he's taking an offering for Corinth, for believers in Jerusalem, because they don't have money. Or even in Acts, Barnabas is selling his property in order to give to the church so that widows and orphans and those who are working hard but maybe aren't able to buy food are able to eat and have all of their needs taken care of. So whoever gives to the poor will not want, because they see and they notice and they give graciously. And they're not trying to hoard and keep their money, in which, as we've noticed, they're trying to do whatever they can to keep it. They're not willing to give it out. So then the one who hides his eyes, that is to not help the poor, not help the widow or the orphan, will get many curses. I think we've seen the punishments in the way, but the Bible, God explicitly tells Israel that if you don't help the orphans and the widows, that curses will come upon the people, because God looks after the orphans and the widows, and to disregard them is basically an affront to God, saying, no, I don't love all your people. And God does not like that. And so curses abound. Curses on earth. They may lose their money. They may receive punishment from the courts. And ultimately, they will receive the curse from God when they spend eternity in hell. If they're not caught on this earth, the great Jehovah will, who sees all, who knows all, will punish and will vindicate the poor. We see this with the rich man and Lazarus. The Lazarus is at the gate, is not received food, and yet we see him in the bosom of Abraham, and the rich man is in hell, and there's nothing he can do about it. the same thing. When we look out and we see the poor and we help out, we show and give blessings to those around us. And I think there's ways to do that where you meet both the physical need and the spiritual need. I think both need to be supplied. It's not one or the other, it's a both. But the one who hide doesn't love God, and he will receive the curses of it. And finally, in verse 28, our last verse for the night, it reads, when the wicked rise, people hide themselves, but when they perish, the righteous increase. I think we can see this, and especially in light of all the talk about greed, all the talk about hoarding our money, that when the wicked with money usually comes with some sort of power, when they rise to power, when the wicked rise, the people hide themselves. They run away. Those who may be more financially well off will try to avoid them, lest the wicked try to befriend them and take their money. What we've seen throughout all of church history, when wicked rulers rise, they persecute the righteous. They try to persecute the church for standing up to show their sinfulness. John the Baptist tells Herod he can't marry his brother's wife. He gets arrested. What happens? His brother's wife asks her daughter, after she pleased Herod with her dance, asks for the head of John the Baptist. When the wicked rise, people hide themselves. And I think what's interesting here is when it says people, it's not specific. It's not a certain type of people. I think in general, when the wicked rise, even those who, for lack of a better way to say it, is less wicked, maybe their sins are not as grievous, would be probably the better way to say it. If they think it's wrong, they tend to hide themselves. And they try to distance themselves and allow the ruler. And I think we see that in the Holocaust, and in some sense, I'm not saying like those who didn't push against Adolf Hitler are better off, but just the idea of people hiding themselves from the wicked. So what happens when they perish? I think it's interesting. Again, it doesn't tell us how they die. We can assume maybe God had killed them. He did kill them, but does he do it by like a natural means, stroke, heart attack? Or is it through war, or a kind of violent, or someone, maybe like Caesar, like they traded. A traitor stabs him in the back. Like the death here is not known, but they perish. What happens when they perish? The wicked or the righteous increase. And so we might be able to imply that the people who hide themselves are the righteous, and they're hiding themselves from persecution. But when they die, the righteous increase. They're able to move freely again and to exercise what they've done. They're, instead of kind of hiding and maybe blessing people as they can down under, kind of these like secret church kind of thing, maybe like modern China. What happens if the Chinese government collapses? The dictator dies, and they now have this kind of freedom and the increase that they can now grow in. I think the increase here again is not specific. This can be numerical, that the righteous, that there are more who are righteous as the gospel is now open to spread. This can be the righteous themselves increasing more abundantly in blessings for their faithfulness during this wicked time. We've seen this in the church, kind of, and you think about in English history after Bloody Mary and the reign of Elizabeth, and kind of the blessings that come from her reign, Elizabethan era, or Queen Victoria in the Victorian era, and this increase of righteousness of the gospel, and to think about how wickedness stifles that. And with the wickedness, again, their greed is shown out and punished. And now the righteous and are abundantly blessed, or enriched with more blessings, both temporal and spiritual. So I think even in these verses that don't talk about money directly, we can see the applications. I do think Proverbs is structured in a way that we are to understand those verses, not individually, and their application is wide, but even narrowly, and to think about it within the context here of greed. So I realize probably some of this was rambling, and I apologize for that. I had to have more material than what I was expecting, and hopefully, even in that, you found this encouraging and helpful. I think there's a lot to think about, especially in America, that we are, in one sense, very rich. Even the poor in America are richer than people in Africa, people in South America. America is a blessed country. We are a rich country, and everyone in America, in one sense, is rich. And oftentimes, because of where we're at and our short sightedness, we think of rich of millionaire, billionaire, and not necessarily that we have technology. We have a phone, we have TV, we may have a car, we're able to buy food. There are people that just aren't able to do that, and there's some in America that aren't. But we think about third world countries around the world, we're very blessed. And I think when we think about this, we may think of ourselves maybe not greedy, but I think there is a sense in which in American Christianity, we have become greedy with our money, in how we build churches, how we deal with our church budget. And are we ones who are helping the poor around us, helping our fellow church members when they need a little extra? Are we helping missionaries so that they can be blessings among the people they serve? And I think there's ways that oftentimes we may not think about it, because in America, in perspective, I'm not rich. I don't have a lot of money. I don't have a fancy car. I don't have a fancy house. And we consider that not being rich. And yet, I'm sitting in front of $1,000 plus of technology, where people in Africa couldn't even fathom something like this. I think it helps us to put this in perspective. And are we deceiving ourselves in our greediness because of where we're at in America and not worldwide? And just to think about that, how am I being greedy? I think that's a valid question. I may not think about it when I compare myself to other Americans, but what about those in the third world? What about missionaries helping them? Am I willing to part with money, even in this tough economic time, to be a blessing to others. Because God has blessed us richly, especially in America. And this isn't to say that America is a Christian nation. I don't think we are now. We were built on Christian principles. Obviously, the culture, especially the culture of death, it's very antithetical to morality in which the Bible tells Christians how to live. But that doesn't mean the Lord hasn't blessed us. And our question is, how are we going to use the blessing as faithful men and women who trust the Lord to bless others, so that we're not in this kind of wanting and needing idea. So that has been episode number 636. Partiality is not good. I hope that this is helpful and can give you something to think about, and even to kind of in one sense rebuke us here in America for, or at least challenge us to consider, are we ourselves being greedy? May the Lord convict us and change us if we are. To see those blind spots by the Lord. Next week is Thanksgiving week. And so we may have a show. We may not, depending on what's going on and kind of the happenings. So join us next week. Watch our socials. We try to get shows scheduled at least a couple days in advance, so you know what's coming up, so you can see that on YouTube. If you want to listen to a back catalog, we have a lot of our podcasts on YouTube, and we have more on Podbean there. So if you enjoyed this, we ask you to like, to share it. Hopefully this could be a blessing to others. And as always, for Ricky, my name is Mike. God bless, and stay Baptist.